And I think Sean Melito is uniquely qualified to take on this task. So I'm going to let him introduce the panel. Sean is with NPC, as you guys know. I think everybody knows Sean. He's our co-chair of this event and a frequent speaker at the event. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sean.
Thank you, Tom.
That's all I had to say.
I need to get out of the way. All right. So normally I would interject, thank you for coming to the 8 a.m. the morning after panel, but I'm just too tired. I'm not going to come up with anything, so we'll go right on to the. Am I speaking into the mic? Is this good? Can you sibilance check? All right. So why don't I let everybody introduce themselves? We can do the "What do you do here?" speech. Why don't we start at the very end with Kelly?
Hi, I'm Kelly Arten. Can you hear me? I'm an Assistant Vice President and underwriter at Liberty International, and I underwrite cyber and technology liability.
I'm Ozzy Fonseca with Experian, Senior Director of the Data Breach Team. My team and I have been privileged to have supported over 15,000 data breaches over the last 10 years or so.
Adam Catini from Arthur J. Gallagher, Managing Director, focused on risk management clients, cyber risk management.
My name is Jeremy Barnett, Senior Vice President of Marketing at NAS Insurance. We are a leading cyber provider based here in Los Angeles. So welcome, everybody.
And Simon Barker, Managing Partner, Blue Moon Consulting Group. We are a small crisis management firm.
And as Tom introduced me, yesterday is the comparable Sean Melito. I think that's his attempt at either a dig or a compliment. I don't know. I'm a management consultant for MPC. We do notification and call center services. All right, so let's get started. Let's set the stage. What would be a post-breach panel without some sort of case? Considering the city that we're in, Tom asked us to anonymize this company, the very original Company X. But of course, if you don't know who this is, you're probably in the wrong room. Company X and the Nightmare Breach, C-level executives, board member emails leaked, trade secrets and intellectual property gone, personal information breached, product launches delayed, some projects sent to Netflix immediately, probably because it was a horrible movie, but anyway. Direct impact to revenue, goodwill, and reputation. So what do we want to do here? Unfortunately, this is formatted poorly, but we want to dig into what could have been done differently in pre-breach preparation and post-breach response. And why do we want to do this? Well, love him or hate him, Dr. Poneman seems to think that about 68% of a per-person breach cost is directly related to what Jeremy coined early on in this process is long-tail costs, or customer churn, lost in revenue, and decline in profitability. That wasn't a joke. So, Simon, why don't you start us off with the PR aspect of this, and what you would tell a client either in a pre-breach or a post-breach situation?
Well, a few things. There's certainly when you're in a situation that was described in the scenario, you're in a world of hurt. And it's going to be difficult to recover from something like that. It's going to take a long time. I think what we find is that the majority of the impact of a breach is the degree to which the organization is prepared in advance, and it is the response that has the biggest impact on the reputational damage to the institution rather than the underlying event. So I think that's a key takeaway, that a poor response can be more damaging to reputation than actually what happened. And I think in that scenario, there's a few obvious takeaways. It's generally not a good idea to threaten to sue the media. That typically doesn't really go down very well. So let's make sure we take that off the table as one of our strategies here to reduce risk. It's also not a very good idea to actually delete social media posts. That may be sort of immediately satisfying, but generally makes the situation a lot worse. And that's really the lesson here. What we need to really think about is, when we think about reputational risk, what do we mean by that? And the way I try to describe reputational risk is that it's when there is a significant disconnect between what you do and what your stakeholders expect, okay? And so the further away your actions are from what they want you to do or what they think you should do, that's when the reputational damage is the most significant. On this slide here, we talked about a lot about the sort of insurable direct costs. As that previous slide said, you know, there's certainly sort of three quarters of the risk here is in these indirect costs due to customer churn, a lot of trust management, distraction, sort of what we would call reputational damage. And I think, while Jeremy's going to talk a little bit about the insurance solution there, the key differentiator is, have you got a good management response plan to, and you're thinking through those stakeholder expectations. How do I do this? Like this? Okay. This is kind of an interesting slide. Now, if we think of sort of crises, and the majority of sort of breaches never hit this level, right? Because they're fairly routine. Their credit card information, something screwed up, there's no malicious, it's not very exciting, we've lost 20,000 records. The reality of the sort of media environment today is that there's a lot of noise out there, and a story may be posted on 20 sites, but there's no actual reporting. There's no actual original reporting. Newsrooms have really been eviscerated, mainly because of the problems with the internet and stuff like that. So, you know, the budgets in an average newsroom has really gone down. The staff in an average newsroom has really gone down. So what you'll see when you do disclose, normally is you'll get 20 hits, but nobody's actually doing anything with it. And there are certainly a number of data breaches that I've been involved in where, you know, you're prepared, you've got everything ready, you've anticipated things, and it's deathly silence, nothing. So we get through that. This is really for those more systemic, problematic risks. The first breach I was involved in was in 2005, and it was called CSSI, Card Security Systems Incorporated. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but it was a card systems provider, lost 40 million records. Now, if you're a payment processor and you lose records, that's a problem. They were bankrupt within 3 days. So that is sort of the ultimate loss of value. And that does happen. And I think when we think about reputational risk, to the extent that your protection of data is close to your core business and customer expectations, the larger the impact is going to be. So if you're a financial institution, if you're a healthcare institution, the impact is going to be far more significant than if you are a pizza company or you're a widget maker or so forth, right? So this slide really is kind of interesting. This is looking at significant crises. We could look at VW as one of those, where they really have broken the trust and they're undermined their fundamental reputation. In the case of VW, obviously about environmental cars, they lost 35% of market value in 3 days again.
This is the blood pressure of the CEO from Volkswagen chart that we're looking at here?
Yeah, the flat line. Yeah, the flat line, exactly. Well, of course, and that's the other sort of typical thing that happens in a poor response, and we see it time and time again. I don't think we were talking about Sony, but Amy Pascal obviously left fairly soon. CIO of Target left fairly soon, CEO. These large ones have pretty fundamental impacts on the organization. Here, this is a 1-year chart of stock. And basically the delta there is about 30% of lost value between those companies that perform well and those that didn't in a crisis. So that's what we're trying to solve for. When I sort of normally get involved and asked, the typical drive is, I think we need a press release. I think we need a press release. And I'm like, I think we're going to need a lot more than a press release. And we're going to need a lot more than a press release for a number of reasons. One is, and the key one is, when we think about how we're going to communicate, I would suggest let's take the focus a little bit off media. In most cases, it's really who is the key stakeholder that we care about, right? To understand who the key stakeholder is, we're going to be in a much better position to respond to meet their needs. So it could be our employees, right, if we've lost employee data, or it could be our patients if we're healthcare, or our customers if we're financial services. What are they expecting us to do? And so when we think about the communications, we're not just thinking about how do we respond to media, but we need to think about what do we need to do for those stakeholders. And they can be pretty broad, right? And you obviously include investors if you're publicly traded and so forth. I would just quickly go through this. It's also not just more than a press release because of the broad range of stakeholders we need to deal with, but also in terms of how are we prepared. And I think this is a theme that's come out from this session and yesterday's about what do we mean by that. Unfortunately, some of my wonderful formatting in this has gotten a little screwed up, but there's basically 4 components to effective crisis management. The who's responsible for what. And that, in the context of cyber, really depends on the organization. But we've talked a lot about instant response plans. We need to have data security or cybersecurity instant response plans, whatever we call those. And they're called incident response plans. I did a lot of work with a large financial institution, and the CEO, they really blew one particular data breach. And the CEO said, I want to know every time one of our records is at risk. 200 times that year, there were events that potentially put customer records at risk. So depending on the size of the organization, you have to understand what is an incident, what is a crisis, right? And who's going to be responsible for what. The why didn't we learn about this earlier is, and we were just talking earlier, it's like, how do we get information, how do we escalate it so we understand what the risk is, we understand what's being done. How does information get escalated in the organization? One of the biggest challenges from a communications perspective is the timeline, right? We found out about it in, where are we? We're October. We found out about it in February. And we worked on it, and we brought in forensics, and we did this, and we couldn't find anything, and then it's sort of June. And then it's that slowness, and I understand there's complications in the forensics, but that timeline is a killer from a reputation perspective, because it looks like you guys are asleep at the wheel. You guys don't even know what you're dealing with in terms of your own system. So the faster you can actually get the resources to really understand that risk, the timeline gets constrained. And I think the Anthem one, they really did a good job. Where you see organizations respond very quickly, empathetically, it's because the timeline's pretty short. And if you've got a timeline of 18 months, you're going to have a hard time explaining that. What do we need to do and what do we need to say? They are the two other key questions we need to ask in terms of crisis management. What do we need to do is the key piece, right? How are we going to solve the underlying problem? How are we going to close this? What are we going to demonstrate? What are we going to do to demonstrate that we've taken it seriously, that we've learned from the event? And then what are we going to say? So the what are we going to say is critical, but if you haven't got the rest of that, then you're not going to be in a good position to actually be able to communicate effectively that as an organization you take the risk of cyber seriously and you've done this, that, and the other. Some of the basic things we need to make sure we understand is there is obviously the importance of the communications, and we've talked a lot about Brian Krebs calling and how you're going to deal with that. But we do need to have consistent messaging across stakeholder. What kills organizations if they're telling their sales team one thing and they're telling external audiences another. They're telling employees one thing and media another. And oftentimes, certainly in large organizations, the people who own those stakeholder relationships are very different people, right? And they're off doing their own thing. We need to make sure that we have a way of communicating in a consistent fashion. That gap will be picked up and it will cause problems if we're saying different things. We do need to, and to some degree, I think all of us are a little bit blasé about this kind of, because we deal with it all the time. But particularly in healthcare, I think, there's a lot of sensitivity about these records and the kind of information it has, particularly if it is medical information. And so when we are communicating, we do need to have some kind of compassion here, and we do need to do that. Again, Anthem was a good example, as opposed to another company that was going to sue the media. That was sort of like, we feel your pain, right? We do need to have that kind of sort of sense to it. Think through answers to the hard questions. Nobody really wants to answer these hard questions, but if you haven't got the 20 questions down that you do not ever want to have to answer publicly, you need to have those answers clear. You need to understand what it is you need to do to have positive answers, and you need to have those clear. It doesn't get shared externally. It's not an FAQ. It's those broader policy impact questions that we need to think through the answers, and that typically drives a lot of action. Understanding the role of your CEO and spokesperson. CEOs can really make life difficult. They're obviously wonderful people, but from a response perspective, they typically can make things worse if they want to sort of jump into the fray at a point where it's not really appropriate to do that. So talking to your CEO in advance of what is the appropriate level of response, when do they get involved, when is it more somebody else who needs to manage it, is really, really important. And if they haven't been media trained and they say things that come off half-cocked, you can really cause major problems. And I think when we see CEOs sort of leave, it's typically because the way they've responded has seemed insensitive to stakeholders. And people are like, yeah, this guy's got to go. Social media. it can be a real problem in terms of, the good thing is it's an early warning indicator, right? So make sure when you're in that position, you know you've got something, start to monitor it. It can alert you to the fact that there may be a problem coming earlier. It also typically upsets our timeline. You know, we'll be plodding along, doing our forensics, working out our legal stuff, and then suddenly it will break. So it does give us information, but we need to understand how does that impact our strategy? How do we engage? And I typically tell clients, if we're very social media focused, if we're an e-commerce entity, and then you have one of these events, you can't just suddenly go completely quiet either. It's got to be in sync with your personality as an organization. And then the final thing, and then we'll obviously talk about it, is stop talking. There is a tendency amongst some people to think that if they talk about it, that somehow it will make it better. And even though I'm at sort of my background was Edelman and communications, the key thing is stop talking. There is no benefit in most instances of actually saying much. You will only make it worse. And so in almost every instance, unless there's a compelling reason, it is much better to go with written statements, email responses, and just keep it there. You will get caught by some gotcha journalist who wants to make you look silly. That is unfortunately the dynamic we're in. If you can avoid direct media, then that is the way to go. And again, you don't need to answer every media question. You don't need to engage. The question about Kreb always comes up. And I think the challenge in answering that is you may inadvertently confirm his story, that he has no idea. He's just fishing around saying, I don't think we've got something. He may have some info, but not enough to actually break a story. But if you then go back and confirm it, before you are ready, you've just given him his story, essentially. So I think all of those issues where we're at a point of disclosure before we're ready, before we have the facts, before we thought through the impacts, before we thought through what are we going to do about it, really can cause the sort of the reputational damage that we're trying to solve for. So I hope that was short enough. But
Excellent. No, thank you very much. Let's change gears a little bit here. We'll go to more of a pre-breach situation. Adam, as a broker, what do you want to hear from a client? And Kelly, as an underwriter, what do you think is a good risk?
So the broker has a pretty big challenge because oftentimes what you want to hear from a client is not what you're going to receive. And we have to balance that equation because we understand that when we go to do an evaluation, what we'd like to try to achieve is a really good story before we even talk to an underwriter so that you can put forth your best foot right off the top. So we're looking for prevention. And we talk about how you should approach these conversations. And what I really like to stress is be prepared with the person in the organization who is your spokesperson. So just like we mentioned the CEO with the big mouth, we also need to make sure that the person who's speaking on behalf of the organization is knowledgeable and has authority to push down controls. And I like to refer to those individuals as the CIO or CISO. And we try to start with the prevention conversation.
Right. So once, as an underwriter, what you're looking for, once your broker has prepared, the client that's interested, you want to see that one of the things we look for is that they're prepared, they answer questions, that they do the network assessments, and that if there's any vulnerabilities from the assessment, that they've taken care of it and implemented anything in that regard. And you just want to make sure that there's constant risk management in place, right down from the top to the bottom, and that everyone is talking, that the information security team is talking to the executive board of directors or the senior executives, and that they're working together so the right hand knows what the left hand's doing and there's a consistent message.
It's such a balance too because we talk about the security awareness, the vendor management, all these items we're going to address, and Kelly looks at each of these individual pieces. She has certain hot buttons that she believes are important for underwriting evaluation. When a broker is talking to a client, you're talking to a myriad of different sizes and types of clients, and preparedness is way across the board. And what I think I've seen for the most part is that even when you think you're talking to a risk management client, the perception is it's a risk management client and they're going to have really good preparedness. And I think ultimately there is some of that. but it depends who you're speaking to in an organization. And I find that on the business side, there is a little bit of a lag in between what they believe the IT folks are doing. So bringing the prevention conversation together in unison between your risk management team, your IT folks, and your general counsel at a minimum, and also finance, is very important. Starting out with that security network assessment piece of it, oftentimes I find that there is network assessment activity going on, and when we start talking about evaluation, and Kelly, you probably can attest to this, you're having a conversation with a client on a conference call, and you start getting mixed signals.
Right.
And I think, and actually, when we talked about an incident response plan, which is a huge theme today. I feel like 1/3 of your evaluation almost begins with incident response, because if you set the tone with talking about preparedness, you've got this incident response plan that you could talk to, but then here comes Kelly saying, so tell me about your incident response plan.
Right. That's like a lot of times when there is an underwriting call there's a lot more calls with the clients, and you're talking with, usually it's involved, you have the risk manager, you have the head of information security, like the CSO, you'll have HR, you'll have legal, you have a whole bunch of things, and you just kind of want to make sure that they have this incident response plan in place and that they've tested it, and they know who is responsible essentially for what. Sometimes they don't know, like, well, we're not really sure, if they don't have it, or we haven't tested it, you want to make sure that you have it and it works.
Yeah, that's when the broker gets involved and says, well, no, they've tested it. I'm telling you they've tested it. I'm going to make a big statement on that one. And then you start working on the backside for preparation, saying you've got to test this thing. Security awareness is very important. Let's talk a little bit about that. What I think is, one of the biggest concerns that we see out there today is the whole social engineering and phishing situation, which actually, when you think about it, you're seeing the actual loss in that category coming from the transfer of funds. So we'll talk later on about where's their coverage gaps, et cetera, but that's a huge issue.
Right.
And what are you guys working on to deal with that?
Well, one of the things that we like to see is that when someone is onboarded on a company, that they do have some sort of annual or policy in place for social media, for what you're responsible for as an individual, as an employee, that the company does annual phishing campaigns or monthly campaigns on other IT issues, whether it's an email blast, to their employees about, policy retention, documentation, clean desk policy, and things like that also. So those are things you're asking for. But a lot of companies now are doing monthly or quarterly phishing campaigns, what we're seeing.
And the slide is entitled Look to Expert Advice. So a lot of this might not be something that your organization can provide. The insured might not have the capabilities. So there are recommended vendors and people whom you can speak with.
Yes, there's companies that offer, that they vet out, that they'll hire to do the campaign for them. And even as they start it, they have executives that click on it. They'll know how many people pretty quickly.
Right. Vendor management. So a topic of conversation that it transcends a lot of our breaches that we speak about today, where you might see the vendor as the root cause for the breach. So you can look inwardly and see what you're trying to do to obviously make your profile a better risk to help prevent potentially a bad choice of a partnership that might not actually provide you with the partnership you had expected. Part of that partnership goes into the contract review process, and looking at strong indemnification, probably one of the major criteria to evaluate.
Right, especially you want to know who's responsible for what. What are the limitations? What is your responsibility? What is your responsibility to your customer, and so on in that regard? Because that will really help. What happened? Like example would be like Anthem, where they had a contract. The contracts with their saying that they would be responsible.
Yeah. Very good. Very good example. The reg compliance piece is huge. I think in today's environment, and on here is federal, state, proposed federal, but the EU has gotten a lot of buzz recently with the safe harbor. So we've got a lot to talk about internationally. And our complex legal environment, worldwide environment, is clearly something that falls outside of the reach of most legal counsel at this point. And so you have to look to expert advice. You have to get ahead of this. This is probably, what I would suggest is going to become the biggest topic we're going to talk about in 2016 is trying to figure out what we're going to do with the EU Safe Harbor component of the conversation, which looks like it's going to cause tremendous amount of grief. In meeting a client recently, one of their biggest concerns is that they have centralization of their database, and now they feel like they have to go through a decentralization process. So it's going to become a really big problem, costly to say the least. Regarding incident response planning, underwriters themselves are going to look at, and we're going to drill down on this just a little bit, a few components of the response plan.
Right.
As I said before, I feel like this is about a third of evaluation, meaning that if you can set a good tone from the get-go, you're going to put Kelly in a pretty good mood.
Yes, you will. So one of the things we keep talking about is working together as a team, the company itself in the incident response plan, making sure that senior management is involved with the information security team, with HR, with legal, finance, and that they're meeting. Like, does the information security team meet with the board of directors or the senior executives? Like, how often? What is their visibility? How much do they really know about their information security and what's supposed to be going on? And then what will happen is, if you're testing it, who's responsible for what in that plan? What is the escalation process? Like, what is the responsibility? If it is, we were talked about, the 200 times that, every time something happens, well, do you really need to? Like, what's the level of escalation? Like, do you, like red, yellow, green kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, Simon mentioned before that timing is such a critical component. And I think that with this planning process and with the incident response planning component of this discussion, you get to timing at least that much quicker. Mm-hmm. And it helps you to get there that much faster with a few other items under the belly that are important. Incident response planning is a good conversation to have, and we talk about it a lot, but I also think that you have to peel it back a little bit. And when you peel it back just a little bit, you have to realize that you've chosen partners, and with those partners come agreements to work with them, and we have to prepare for that piece of it. So it's not just putting it on paper, tabletop exercises, right?
Like quarterly or annual tabletop exercises, almost like a calling tree. So you actually go through an incident or a breach, because there is a difference between incident and a breach, and you see who's responsible for what. You have your little calling tree. If this happens, you go the next level, up and up and up, as I say, an escalation. And it's really important, because if something happens, the costs are going to escalate so quickly that a small company could potentially go out of business if they don't have a policy in place or procedures or even insurance.
And then there's the notion of turnkey solutions versus sort of crafted solutions.
Right.
And what would be the best fit?
I think it really depends on the size of the company and their sophistication sometimes. If you have a smaller size company that does not know, like the turnkey would be the best, where you have, under a policy, you have your breach panel and your partners already in place. If you're a larger company and you use people to already, you can have them part of your policy depending on that, if you already have, a contract with them.
And just to reiterate, if you have a turnkey solution, you might have choices that are there in the policy itself, but you might have a delay. Again, I think from our perspective, timeliness is going to be a pretty big theme of today's panel, because when you have an event, we'll call it an event until it becomes an actual breach. But when you have this incident or this event, and you need to fire up your response plan, one of the things you want to make sure of is that you can effectuate that response plan as quickly as possible, and that includes looking at the MSA, taking care of those real critical agreements that under pressure you might be asked to complete an MSA, a master service agreement, so that you can effectuate and actually start the planning. Part of this whole entire response planning component is to get ready for that. So don't just list it. Be prepared for it and have your master service agreement already executed, so you're not signing under crisis. So this way you are not, again, delaying a timely response. Now, when it comes to breach notice, one thing you want to do with an incident response plan is you want to make sure that you're dovetailing what you have in the way of insurance with what you think your plan's going to say, or what your plan might say and what you might think your insurance policy says. And I think that's one area where I constantly see the disconnect is I have a insured A who would like to use a law firm or forensics firm, but doesn't have that firm on the panel, or has made a request to use a separate firm, but hasn't gotten the rates to match up with what an insurance company would like to pay in the form of rates, or potentially the insurance company really isn't hot for that particular provider because they believe another provider can do it just as good, has more experience, and can actually do it at a better rate. Trying to convince a client that that's the way to go oftentimes is a problem after the fact. So when you're broker in a situation like this, one of the things you need to deal with is how do you get this conversation on the table on the front side so that we can make a response under a practical insurance response on the back side, make it work. And one thing I will say is when you talk about breach response notice, keep in mind the prior approval requirements within the incident response or breach response coverages, because that might come into play.
I think that's a good point to make. I mean, it is a partnership. You know, the insured and their carrier, it is a partnership. You're trying to mitigate costs on both ends. And if you have a agreement up front, it definitely will help everyone. And I think that's a valid point. And I think a lot of carriers will work with their insured.
Sure. Also, a lot of our breach response notifications have 1-800 numbers, 24-hour hotlines. Oftentimes, that doesn't mean you're reporting a claim. So part of the response process has to involve your broker. And I always like to say that my first call goes into our qualified privacy attorney, who then sets forth a chain reaction of events. But an insurance broker does need to be part of this process if you have an insurance policy, because you want to make sure proper reporting is being done. And obviously, if there is the notion that you're going to use vendors or partners, those partners have to either be approved or potentially have prior approval, even if they are on a panel. Very important topic of conversation.
Yes.
Kelly, as far as initial evaluation coverages, what's the expectation in terms of what a client should see from the insurance company?
Well, first what they should see is if they report an incident, you know, they call in and they can call in like their breach response team will come in. They'll evaluate what should be the next steps, and that would include forensics. It can include, you know, if it is an actual breach, setting up a call center, like the notification letters going out, working with your different vendors, like you have a choice.
Time frame for a potential letter on that? 30 days approximately?
It depends on the state, but as soon as practicable.
I try to kind of guide to 30 days. I think that's pretty reasonable. It does depend on state requirements.
Yeah.
But I think that a timely response letter that's coming back, what you'll see is that, and the dynamics of these incident responses are interesting in the sense that you're firing up partners right off the bat, but you don't necessarily have a letter coming from your insurance company saying, that's cool, I'm covering that.
No,
You really do need to know when you're starting these incidences that you have language within policy that says, yeah, you know, I can use these firms, it's pretty cool, if it's covered, and I'm going to say if it's covered, right?
Right.
Then these firms were approved. Again, back to prior approval, I think that's very important. I actually believe that we like to kind of move from prior approval to pre-approved, which I think is a little bit more of a function of, you know, not necessarily getting into a quandary of trying to get carriers on the phone immediately, particularly on Sundays.
Sure.
But, you know, let's get prior approval on the table, and then we do reporting appropriately and within a timely manner. Post-breach litigation, be ready for your defense, because that's, I think, what we've got a trend in the world today, is getting ready for your defense. How do you like this little rudimentary chart that I put together? I had my 11-year-old put this together for me. It looks so beautiful, doesn't it? But as rudimentary as it is, the purpose of the chart is to show you and to highlight that you should be prepared, and be prepared for a deep level of response. So you might have conflicts. You might have a single point of failure aggregation style event where everybody's seeking some sort of legal advisory or some sort of forensics investigations, and it was systemic, and the same event impacted a multitude of clients. So are you not going to be able to get access to that forensics firm that was your choice A? And potentially, could you actually lose access to B and C? So just be prepared. And I think as part of this process, when you're visualizing this response, is to have a deep responding team. And you can prioritize it by A and B and C, but make sure you know who you're turning to. And I will say to you that breach coach and litigation defense, you might actually want to consider whether you'd like to use the same firm for both, or you'd like to try to have an arm's length transaction on that so that you aren't using the same firm for one and then finding yourself defending on the other side.
Don't we use that also for the cyber bingo game later?
That's great. Yeah, let's see. Hold on. Wait. Forensic C.
Right.
There
Anybody
it is.
have your cards?
Good call. Under risk management and what you'd expect from advisory, there are a slate of concepts out there relative to cyber risk management. And I think we've kind of highlighted, and we're not going to kill into response again. But at the end of the day, there's a slate of services that really are important as part of a cyber risk management philosophy, which we've detailed here. One of the areas, though, that Kelly and I believe we should heavily focus upon is talking about policy design and gaps in coverage, where we really think that there's a disconnect in the world of cyber risk management and then flowing it all the way down to purchasing insurance policies is what is the insured's perception of what they're purchasing versus what we're providing. And as a marketplace, we can provide only what we're able to achieve. I'll give you that classic example of I want bodily injury and property damage coverage because my GL says it's not covered. Can we achieve that?
It depends.
Yeah.
I think that the contingent bodily injury and property damage, it becomes a bigger issue because yesterday we were talking about aggregation and where it falls under other policies. A utility, if you're insuring a utility, or I just think that if someone hits a line and it explodes, or the automobile with the driverless cars, or the technology, like where is it stemming from? It could affect other coverages, like is it a products liability? Is it there? But I think sometimes with the contingent exposure, you're not really underwriting to that. It's a very difficult risk to underwrite because you're so focused in on the cyber aspect of it. This is more of a ancillary coverage that it's more of a, in general in E&O, and especially you're not covering like the contingent bodily injury property damage because you feel like it should be covered somewhere else.
So one of my fears as a broker is, do we have a run of 5 or 6 years and then do we find ourselves in a situation where the general liability marketplace is forced to deal with this better rather than throwing an unauthorized access exclusion onto a policy or completely muddying up the water, and then next thing you know, all of us in the cyber world are working for general liability now because they're going to try to absorb it in, because eventually we're going to come to a point where this issue needs to be dealt with better than what's currently available. And there are some products out there that could offer some level of coverage from an excess position. But when we're talking about bodily injury and property damage, and we're coming up against the general liability policy and the cyber policy, recognizing that we have a financial loss policy in cyber liability, and the bodily injury property damage events that are occurring from cyber-oriented type events, we are going to converge. And we might have 5 years before this culminates. That's a prediction, I suppose, if you want to call it that. But I think that we have to deal with this as a marketplace, but we're not ripe for it yet. Yeah. And one area where I think we are, in fact, dealing with it in the general liability space, where it's not bodily injury and property damage, but just the plain vanilla financial loss pieces of it, is under the provisions of other insurance, where we're triggering general liability coverages under the advertising personal injury coverage. And we actually have to deal with what's this topic of other insurance, which is kind of interesting. And we have sort of, we've kind of embraced it in certain lines of business, such as lawyers professional.
Yeah, so what we're, now with like lawyers and accountants under their E&O policy, they have a quasi coverage, I would say, for the cyber under the data breach, the liability portion of it, not so much with the first party coverages. And what we have seen and we have done is that our policy will be primary for the lawyers and accountants when it comes to the liability of the cyber risk. And specifically, you can right that you will be primary, but you recognize that they have that other policy. Those policies are excess over.
And then just to tie it together with general liability, that's an area where we also need to address. So Lawyers Professional makes a good example of an E&O product line and a cyber product line, which are sort of in the same genre, but general liability falling a little bit to the side. That primary provision might be a bigger concern as we move forward. As we start seeing more litigation, and we do have to deal with the notion that we might be triggering other policies unexpectedly, and we need to figure out what is primary and make sure we are writing accordingly. And then the last coverage gap issue that we wanted to address, or design of policy, is system failure. What does a client really think they're purchasing when they purchase their business interruption? Outside of what we're going to get to next on the brand guard piece, is am I getting the ultimate in open perils, which is called system failure, as opposed to maybe more of a named peril attack on a system? Is it available?
Some companies do offer that coverage, but I think it's a very difficult risk to cover, just because the policy really is for a financial loss to a third party. Technically, it's a liability policy, even though there are first party coverages involved. And a true system failure can happen just because your network went down and you, the company, lost income, not to the third party. So I think it's a little bit difficult, to ensure that in a way.
Yeah,
That's not it's a business loss.
And it is a topic that is very difficult to address, and when it is addressed in policies, depending on size of company and what's being provided, you might find yourself in a category of sublimit for a system failure versus the general business interruption clause, which is likely going to meet the aggregate limit of liability, or aggregate limit on the policy. So we kind of went through, the only one we did leave off was the dependent business interruption. Just one other notion in staying in line with business interruption. What is available in business interruption from a dependent perspective? Can we achieve it?
You can achieve it. Again, it's difficult because you actually have to underwrite and understand your insured's partner's risks. So what you want to see when you are offering this dependent business interruption is the contracts and who's responsible and the liability of what the contractor is providing to the insured.
So the advice to the insured from a broker is detail out your vendors that you're working with, have a full appreciation, understanding. And what I like about that concept, I'm not averse to listing out providers, to be honest, because I think it helps in the risk management process. To be blanket across the board oftentimes makes an insured somewhat feel as if they don't have to watch or manage themselves as closely. But what I also can tell you is when insureds do push back on it, because you do have to list out and kind of collect your biggest providers and potentially leave out smaller ones if you miss them, the key is that in some of the more regulated industries, this is already being done. So if you're being regulated, you might have already gone down the road of vendor management, and it is becoming a much bigger item on the menu of what you should be doing on risk management, not just to achieve insurance, but just the overall landscape of this risk is really pushing our insureds to collect this type of data.
Excellent. Okay, very, very comprehensive. Let's Ozzy, for a man who's handled 15,000 breaches over the year, you've been eerily quiet. So let's if you could shed some light on the post-breach offer. So the breach has occurred. What can we offer, and what are the pros and cons of each?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to go over that. The reality is data breaches happen every single day. And actually, if you look around the room, every single company represented here today is at risk and can have a data breach, and at some point may experience one of those events. What is more important is not to try to keep preventing those, which obviously you should do, but consider what exactly are you doing after the breach occurs. And that's something that I know every panel talks about preparation, every panel talks about practicing the tabletop exercises. And once a breach happens, believe me, it is incredibly important to have been prepared, to have practiced the event well ahead of time, because there are quite a few complications that can occur, and I'll cover that at the end if time permits. But there are certain offers that you can make to the victims to try to make them whole, try to mitigate the risk of identity theft, try to really do the best you can with the circumstances that you're dealing with. Interestingly enough, actually 67% of people affected by a breach have an expectation that identity protection will be provided for them, 67%. However, most companies don't do anything about it. They'll send letters out, they'll notify the individuals and the regulators, but they will not make any kind of an offer at all. And there are different reasons. At the core is really cost. It is not cheap to handle a breach, especially because, by definition, it is an unexpected event. There's normally not a budget for that, and sometimes insurance is not going to cover it, or at least not all the various costs. Part of it also has to do with the fact that much larger organizations feel that the switching cost for consumers to go to a different place, get healthcare somewhere else, get their products and services somewhere else, it's so high that the likelihood they're going to leave, it's minimal. So they'll say, you know what, let's just play the odds. But some companies do make an offer. One that is fairly counterintuitive but works well, believe it or not, is discounted merchandise. So providing either a discount or a cash incentive to come back into the stores and continue buying whatever it is you sell. When I first heard about this strategy, I thought, who would do that? Trying to, what appears to be someone trying to monetize a data breach. And the reality is, 63% of people want that. They actually prefer to receive some kind of a cash discount in conjunction with identity protection. So they don't want just a discount, they want to be protected, but also some kind of a concession. For those who do provide identity protection, the terms, credit monitoring, identity protection, fraud resolution, web scanning, they tend to be interconnected and used exchangeably. So I'll just take a moment to really describe what that's really supposed to mean. So ideally, you want a product that has all the things I mentioned here: credit monitoring, web scanning, fraud resolution. But to define the terms a little bit, because identity protection is one of those undefined terms that mean whatever you say it means. Credit monitoring normally means a product that's going to proactively look for medical identity theft, for example. I know some of you will say, well, no, credit monitoring doesn't do anything for medical identity theft. It does, because it tells you medical collections, medical delinquencies, if someone's maybe changing your address, which could mean that your explanation of the benefits was sent somewhere else so you don't get to see it. It gives you public records. It also tells you new accounts being opened in your name, or current accounts that previously were being paid on time, which could mean someone took over your identity, was using it, and now just left you with all the bills. So now you have all these delinquent accounts in your name. That's what credit monitoring does. Web scanning, on the other hand, is a great supplement to credit monitoring. It goes in cyberspace. It looks for your social security number, your credit cards, your debit cards, maybe your medical ID. And it tells you it's out there. And that's an important tool to also have. And finally, fraud resolution is something that's, you have a team of people who are going to help you address whatever the issues that credit monitoring and web scanning have found, and they're going to fix them for you. Now, and I'll make this last point for this slide. Ideally, you want to give someone a product that's going to do both things. It's going to help them monitor information proactively so they find the issue quickly, and then gives them a way to fix the issue through either resolution, restoration, whatever the term that the vendor is using out there, but it has to have both. If you, for example, only provide fraud resolution, the problem is that no one's monitoring the information, so the individual, whatever your insured is paying for, they're not really getting a lot of value because there's no one proactively looking for issues. They're just putting the concern back on the victim's shoulders. They have to figure it out first and then get help. So it's an incomplete solution. I know we're short on time, but I'll talk more about some war stories later.
Okay, thanks. Jeremy, can you walk us through reputational harm coverage?
Sure thing. I think we've fully geeked out here on incident response planning and what goes into a policy, and how there's so many different components to dealing with a breach. And I want to sort of bring the conversation back to where can cyber policies innovate and find ways to address the emerging needs and try to simplify the approach so that it's more put in terms of the buyers of insurance to help them address the real issue where the breach has impact, and that's really at the brand level, right? So the C-suite is concerned about all different components of the operation, but ultimately it comes down to brand integrity following a breach. And so one of the things I want to talk about is how carriers are looking at securing and ensuring reputation. And what does that really mean? Because it's been talked about for years, and how you can get PR as an insured coverage, even outside of a data breach. But the idea that we looked at and that we're introducing as a relatively new program called Brand Guard is the idea that should there be long-term impact to a company following a breach, can there be an insurance coverage for that particular component? And so what you see here in this slide is the idea that there is a breach, there is some sort of adverse media that comes out that affects the brand integrity, and therefore could affect profitability, revenue and or profitability for the entity. And so understanding that equation and figuring out how do we address it was the opportunity for innovation in the insurance policy for cyber liability that is beyond the GL, that starts to address the idea of the business interruption component of handling the breach. Oh, sorry, I got it here. Yep. As Sean had put up before, the idea of understanding these indirect costs. The direct costs, I think we all have a pretty good handle on now. We know who the vendors are. We know what the costs are. It's becoming a more competitive marketplace, and so there's not a whole lot of price elasticity in it. Where there is a big unknown happens to, in the realm of these indirect costs, related to, are we losing customers? Does it impact revenue? How does it impact profitability? In many of the reports that we all get, and we try to define these indirect costs, it's all over the place, and I don't think that anybody has the exact answer for that, and every incident is different, and so those costs are a wide range. But what we wanted to be able to address with the idea of providing a reputation harm coverage as part of a cyber liability policy is to look at these things, that the costs for the legal expenses and the data restoration, the IT forensics are relatively finite. What happens after the fact? How do customers respond? How will the public respond to your brand is a longer term impact. And I think everybody here covered pretty well the fact that it's about reacting in a timely manner, and the insurance is there, and most cyber liability policies are there to help your team address it in a timely manner. The longer term impact or how your customers are going to behave, and that's something that none of us has control over. So organizations who are looking at a cyber liability policy are starting to think, okay, well, what happens after the breach? And so the idea of what we call a brand guard coverage as part of the cyber liability policy is to address just that. And in a situation here that we sort of anonymized, that should a retailer lose a certain percentage of their monthly revenue as a result of the breach, there is the opportunity to cover a business interruption charge here, that there has been a loss in revenue, which has impacted their bottom line, and they can tie it directly back to the cyber breach. That's a real valuable component of an insurance product, to say that's where the reputation harm is. It's not just that. It's not just an emotional response. It's not just how people feel about the brand. It's if they stop reaching for their wallet and purchasing goods. And that's where we recognize that there's an opportunity to extend the benefit of insurance, and also to provide assurance to the executives of the insured organization that, yes, things will happen, things will go wrong, and your insurance policy is there to help extend not just for the cost of response, but for the cost of covering the gap while you get back on your feet. And I think that's that idea of recognizing that it might take some time, that we can stop the bleeding, but it still takes time for the patient to heal, and during that healing time, there is insurance there to help get the business back on track. And so in this particular case, the idea of being able to evaluate that delta between where we used to be and where we are now, and we want to get back on track, that the Brand Guard business interruption coverage pays for the loss in revenue to address the loss in profitability during that short period following the breach.
And what about dependent businesses? So if Star Sub's salami provider has a data breach, is there coverage for that?
Help me clarify that.
So if a business that Star Subs is dependent on, if it suffers a data breach or some sort of incident, or
Okay, right.
Or if
So-
Star Subs is supplying, how does that?
Right. So outside of the brand guard coverage, particularly, and looking across, there are many different components of a cyber liability policy. We, as a carrier, do make available a dependent business interruption charge, so that Star Subs may be dependent on a hosted accounting system that they use for handling payroll and billing and whatnot. And should there be a breach of their data on that side of it, Star Subs can purchase a dependent business interruption endorsement on their policy to help cover that. It's not always included in every cyber liability policy, and it is an important component in evaluating who your other services providers are should they have a breach and how it affects your business. So, yeah, it's an essential component, but not always included within the premium.
Excellent, thanks. I thought Salami Provider was more interesting in accounting software, but all right,
That's
we'll
right,
go with
yeah.
that. So in the last 5 minutes that we've got, Ozzy, who doesn't love a good war story, and hopefully some of the other panel members can chime in as well. Walk us through a few of these stories you've got.
Sure, and to be fair, actually, Sean did my slides, just so you guys know, so I'm still learning what's going on. Basically, there are all kinds of issues that happen all the time that can go wrong during a data breach response. Because again, people don't practice, there's all kinds of issues. I'll go over some of these, but I want to maybe make it even more general over some of the unique circumstances where even after you practice, even after you tried it out a couple of times, there's certain things that are just so unique to your business that you don't really think about that are going to trip you up and also cost significantly more money to address a breach. So for example, one of them is the decision to notify or not notify. Makes a very big deal. All the providers, all the vendors that are here today, we are geared to work very quickly. So when you say go, we go. So, there's no, well, can you go live today? And then we go live, and you say, well, let's take it back. I changed my mind. It doesn't quite work like that. For example, we've had several clients that because of maybe there's a leak regarding a breach or some kind of issue, they decide to go live faster than they really are comfortable doing, and they make arrangements for a provider like myself or others here to get the letters going, get everything ready, the call center, and they'll say, okay guys, I need the letters, and it always happens like this: letters have to go out tomorrow, whatever day it is, doesn't matter, they have to begin tomorrow. So we get ready for that, and it's tomorrow, so letters are going out. In the afternoon of that day, happens very often, clients will come back and say, hey, great news, the forensics came back, we don't have a breach, we had an incident, but there's no breach, get the letters back. Well, letters are gone. That's not going to help anybody, letters are gone. So now, what should have been really a nothing incident is a fairly costly situation. That's the first thing. Something that happens also very often is you have clients that don't quite think about the difficulties of notification. So on the plan, we'll say notify, yeah, okay, so I'll get a file, send out letters, great. But what if you don't have any contact information at all? For example, for a credit card data breach, right? There's just no contact details. And the reason it can cost quite a bit of money and cost to some level some business interruptions, quite a few delays, is the fact that when you have a breach where you don't have any contact details, you're going to have either a press release or some other kind of public notice that's going to force you to worry a significantly larger universe of people than the people who are actually affected. That's going to drive a bunch of phone calls from people who are confused, they don't know if they're really affected or not. And the worst thing is this: they're not going to call the phone number or visit the website that you set up. They're going to call any phone number that they remember or they can find on the internet. And they're going to just flood all these other lines that are now going to have fairly substantial wait times. And they're going to be staffed by employees who, trust me, only one study had this, only 24% of companies ever tell their employees about a breach and actually train them on what to say. So now you have potentially millions of people, thousands of people definitely, calling various phone numbers, staffed with people who have no idea that a breach has even happened. And now and let's say you get a call from the media. So now you got people who are not qualified or supposed to be talking to the media, making comments that are contradictory to whatever your official stance is. I've seen that happen at least 10 times. So it's something worth considering during the underwriting process. Ask those kind of detailed questions. Look at my watch here. I got 1 million of them. Right. So I don't know.
Do you want to have some time to take some questions?
We can get
Yeah?
some questions, yeah.
It's all right. I didn't think we would, but there we go. Any questions at all for the panel? All right.
Hi, Ozzy, you mentioned the difficulty, the decision to notify or not notify. Well, I find that a lot of times in incidents, it ends in where you don't have definitive evidence that there was a breach that happened, but you also don't have definitive evidence that it didn't happen. There's a lot of bad stuff, a lot of unauthorized access, but maybe you just don't have the logs available to confirm. So walk me through some guidance on the reasonable belief construct. How do you give guidance on walking clients down the path of go notify or not notify when the various costs and other impacts of actually notifying could be there versus not notifying? How do we weigh all this? Because it seems like over 50% of these major incidents end in we're not quite sure.
Right.
But it looks real bad.
A great question, thank you.
Yeah.
And it's really it's more a question for Simon from a PR perspective, and I'll tell you what I do know. In this day and age, because of Brian Krebs and the fact that he does a really good job at drawing out people's breaches or incidents, and then he kind of fills in the blanks for you, the timelines, which have always been very constricted, are now ridiculously short. So PR firms have holding statements that they have ready for you that have generic information that allows you to say, we are investigating an incident, we're not quite sure of all the facts yet, we'll keep you apprised of what's going on, and then just be transparent with what you do know. Because what you don't want to do is say, well, nothing happened, or deny something that you know for a fact. If Brian Krebs is calling you, something happened. Okay? So you want to just have enough information so that you're transparent about it, but don't give anything definitive yet. There are quite a few companies that I've seen that have announced a data breach, let's say today, and will not even go live with letters for the next 10 months or so. Especially in last year, where there were so many credit card breaches, quite a few firms felt compelled to have a holding statement and just wait until they had all the details and then go live. And I did not see one of them receive negative press about that approach. Simon, is anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it. I mean, I think the key question really is, in terms of the notification, is understanding the reputational impact. And I think when we have these notifications that say, we don't really know exactly what happened, and there's no evidence of exfiltration, and there's no this, that, and the other, in most situations I've been involved, we have a pretty darn good idea that there's a major problem. We just don't know exactly what it is, and I think it behooves everyone to be as proactive as they can. And I think to some degree that's why the credit monitoring is offered. It's because there is that expectation out there that we have created as an industry that if you have a problem, that's part of the deal. And even if it doesn't solve anything, it does create some sense of goodwill with the customers who've been impacted. The other thing, of course, is that the cost, which is often looked at as a per record cost, is the take-up is infinitesimally small because these things happen all the time. So, I think there's a lot more goodwill that's generated by offering it. Whether or not there's any, and there's obviously a discussion yesterday about the legal liability of offering it, but it feels to me that's one of those things you should just offer. And then you have protected yourself if down the line you find out that, well, we weren't totally sure, but now it turns out that actually the bad guys did get it and they did sell that information. At least you've done the right thing. What we're trying to do in crisis management is be somewhat predictive, right? We're trying to get ahead of where the issue is so that in hindsight, we're like, well, we responded appropriately. And I think timing, appropriate notification, offering some of these solutions to the problem for customers is an integral part of the package.
Actually, both of those answers are incorrect. The correct answer is you do whatever John Mullen tells you to do. All right, well, we're over time. Tom?
Yeah.
We're
Thank
good
you,
to go.
guys. Thanks,
All
Sean.
right,
Thanks to the panel. Nice job.